Bonjour, un, deux, bonjour à tous. Vous m'entendez? You hear me? It's okay? You know, I grew up in south of France. Je suis grandi dans le sud de la France. So I have a very bad accent in French. J'ai un très mauvais accent en français. So I'm going to speak English then. Okay? I would like to thank you, Lourdes. It's a very interesting name for French, Lourdes. You might not know what it means, but it means a lot. And Anna Laura in Monterrey that invited me. You're welcome, come on. The party is here, the evening. And I'm glad to be here in Tech de Monterrey. Actually, I've been in Monterrey for some seminaries, some classes. I was also in Guadalajara, Tech Monterrey in Guadalajara, and now in Mexico. So I know there is 20 others, so I might have other conferences to do, but at least I've been in three campuses of this school, free campus. So I'm pretty glad to be here with you today again. What I'm going to do, we have an hour. It's not very long, especially I'm going to speak about 3 books today. So the 3 books, if you make them in one, it's probably, 1,800 pages. I've done also a PhD, master PhD dissertation on this subject, which is 3,000 pages. Of course, all that in 1 hour is just not possible. But so I give you more just hypotheses and quick conclusions, and sorry for that. My books are at the library, very good library here that Lourdes is director of, and so I hope I will help you to maybe to go further in this subject. And again, I'm sorry just to summarize ideas that might be more that might need more time. Just one word of, it's better to be with you because I look like just maybe some things about my methodology and what I'm doing. Basically, right now I'm doing research I really try to be on the field, on the ground, to do research about what I'm writing. I've done a PhD, as I told you before, so it was a very academic, traditional work. Right now I'm working more on field research, so it's between academic and journalist kind of work. And I've spent the last couple of years, 5-7 years, to travel, to do interviews. It's more than, 2,500 interviews in more than 50 countries. So it's a lot of miles with airplanes. It's not very good for environment ecology, I know. But so whatever I write, it's linked to something I've seen myself. So everything is first-hand. Of course, I use statistics, I use data, I read books and articles, but basically my books are really linked to research that I do myself on the ground. And I believe, even on a subject like internet, which is my last books, is important to go on the ground. You can think, when you think about the internet, you can be here, with your computer, and then you travel the world on the internet, and you don't necessarily have to go on the ground. What it means to go to India or to China if you can see basically the website on your own computer. My hypothesis and my work is basically saying that you cannot do that. You cannot understand internet if you don't go everywhere to see how the people use internet, what kind of content they download, they read, what are the social networks they use, and then you have another view. I don't necessarily think it's a better one, but at least it's a different one. And I would say it's more close to reality. And I'm going to try to show you that during this intervention. Basically, I published 3 books recently. One, Cultura Mainstream, is a book about globalization and content and culture. The second one, which is a smaller book and in a way a quicker one, I took just one small issue, which is the LGBT issue, and the book is called Global Gay and is translated in Spanish as well, about how the world is changing, sometimes and quite often for the better, sometimes for the worst, with this issue, which is, in fact, a human rights issue, a civil rights issue, and how it affects, how globalization has an effect on identities and or on this kind of civil rights fight. And the last book, which is actually, I think there is some copy here, but the book won't be published in Spanish before the beginning of December here, so in 3-4 weeks. It's a book called Smart, and it's a book about the internet worldwide. And I'm going to go in the details in a little bit these 3 books. But they look different, but they kind of are in the same kind of package in a way. One of the main conclusions of the 3 books is about globalization, and in the 3 subjects, I see how globalization is not a uniformization. So the fact that you can access every content on the internet, that you can live a better life when you are gay, for example, not everywhere, but at least in many places. The fact also that culture is more globalized doesn't mean at the end that it becomes totally, that it becomes uniformized. When you look at my book, Cultura Mainstream, if you just read the title, you might believe that the conclusion of the book says, we are going to a more mainstream culture, and everywhere we'll look at content, we'll share the same content, and actually we will be in a large global conversation, and everybody will be part of that. Languages won't be as important as before, culture will be more uniformized, and borders won't exist. Basically, my 3 books are saying this is not what's happening. What we see on the ground, what we see, I do mainly qualitative research, but I use also quantitative one. We don't see a uniformization. On the contrary. And this is why actually the gay issue is interesting, because we believe that the gay are very global and, they all like, I don't know, Lady Gaga and Ricky Martin and Brokeback Mountain and Milk and, the coming out, the gay pride, all these kind of things. But actually, they are more different than ever everywhere. And there is not such a thing as a global gay, actually. And the second element of my books, the second, I would say, large conclusion, is about emerging countries. And in a way, it's about Mexico as well. When we speak about emerging countries, first of all, we sometimes speak only about the called BRICS. You know that very well. Brazil, Russia, India, China. Of course, I believe, like other scholars, that it's not just 5 countries. It's also Colombia, it's also Mexico, it's also Chile, it's also Vietnam, probably, for sure, Turkey, probably maybe Egypt, depending on the next steps of the democracy there, maybe even Iran or Nigeria or Kenya. So it's a group of 20 plus, 25 plus countries. And one of the main conclusions of my 3 books, and I would say it's probably one of the reasons, the Indians and the Chinese told me that they published the book in many languages. We have a lot of scholars and a lot of people have spoken about the globalization as with a link with demography and with economics, of course. And I'm not the first one. millions of articles have been written on globalization in this way. But I see globalization also as a process that, in addition of demography, in addition of economics, it's also linked to identity, it's also linked to emerging culture, but the fact that emerging countries are also emerging with their culture, and it was basically the conclusion of mainstream. They emerge also with their values and human rights, and it was the conclusion of Global Gay, and they emerge also with their internet, and this is the conclusion of SMART. So right now, I'm going to focus a little bit on Mexico, then on emerging countries, speak about the US, cultural industries, diversity, the definition of culture, and then I will conclude with the internet. I hope we will have also some exchanges, some questions at the end of the hour, if you want, and I will be happy also to exchange with you. I begin with Mexico because it's interesting for me, and I will begin with actually with 2 or 3 images. I'm French, so we are very not very formal, so I take that out. I have the French flag, so I think it's at least it's good. Don't know how to put that. Maybe like that. Does it work? I'm going to take the plane to go back to Paris in a few hours, so I have the French flag already, to be ready to come back home. I'm going to begin with 3 images, and I begin in Mexico, where I met a few years ago somebody. His name is Jaime Campos Vasquez. He's in my book Mainstream. He was a nice guy. He was very friendly with me. He's a Peruvian, actually, from citizenship. When I met him here in Mexico City, I remember he had a tie, a very old one, looked like Vasarely. I don't know if you know Vasarely. It's a French artist, very square actually, from the 70s. Nobody buy any work of this guy, even though he's pretty famous. He has been famous a long time ago. And the tie was a Vasarely kind of piece of art, which shows something about how modern he was, but whatever. I don't want to be mean. And this guy was the head of the MPA Mexico. The MPA is the lobby, the main lobby of the movie industry, Hollywood, actually. And the MPA works basically here, but also in Brazil, also in different ways in Argentina, in Colombia, to protect the Hollywood industry. And they protect also at the same time the music industry. So they do the movie and the music industry, because they have it's kind of technical, but they have another arm kind of their organization that is called Asociación Protectora de Cine y Música, and both are working together. So the guy was very nice, and he was speaking. He was explaining me how his fight here is to protect the movies, to avoid any regulation by the Mexican government, to protect the Mexican films. And so his goal is mainly to keep the film industry open, to have the US working well at home here. They do the same again in Brazil and in other countries. He used to be, he told me, so it's not a secret because he told me that publicly, he used to work for the Secret Service in Peru. We don't know why from Peru is here, but whatever. And of course, he is directly linked to the MPAA office in Washington, D.C., where a lot of police people also are working about privacy, technology downloading, about security files and all this kind of thing to protect the movie and the music. And when I spoke to him, he said that he's dealing every day with the president of the MPAA in Washington. I went there, and I went there several times actually, and I met the three main presidents of the MPAA in the US. They are very famous people, and they are extremely rich. I think they are paid several millions dollars a year just to be president of these things. And the first one I met was Jack Valenti. Jack Valenti is very famous in the movie industry. He has been the head for a long time, the head of the MPAA in Washington, D.C. And when I met him, he was already old. He died recently. It's funny because he's a very little guy, but extremely powerful, you know, like a cowboy. And I saw him, and then he took me by hand. You know, you have to follow him. And he said, "You come here." So I came in the part of his office. It was a very big office, and he showed me a photograph. And on this photograph, he was very little, but he was on the photograph decades before. And the photograph is one of the most famous, probably famous photograph in the history of the US. It is, you see President Johnson with the hand like that. Close to him, there is Jackie Kennedy. Another woman with the Supreme Court members. Jack Valenti, little one, behind. And again behind, but you don't see that on the photograph, but we know that, of course. It's the body of Kennedy, which had been killed just a few hours before. So the photograph is very famous because it's in the plane, it's in Air Force One, just a few hours after the killing. And the plane is on Dallas Airport, then it goes back to Washington with Johnson. And at that very moment, President Johnson became president because the Supreme Court member appointed him immediately president after the killing. Then after a while, I went back to the MPAA, and the new president arrived. Jack Valenti was already pretty old, more than 85, 87 years old. And I met this new president. His name is Dan Glickman. And Dan Glickman had been, in the past, he's a congressman. He has been very famous congressman, Democrats from Kansas, and where he was dealing on agriculture issue, especially quotas. And he became the head, he became, first of all, the Minister of Agriculture of Bill Clinton, and then he was appointed head of the MPAA for the movie industry. When I spoke to him, and I've met him several times, so we were kind of not really friends, but at least we know a bit each other. And I said, you know, Dan, you made a mistake. You're in charge of the movie industry, culture, but you were Minister of Agriculture, so something wrong, you know. Agriculture, culture, you're not in the right office. Then he said to me, it's you that you're wrong, Frédéric, because, you know, my job before was to grow corn, and now I sell it as popcorn. Of course, it's a joke, but what it means by that, if you take the free guy, James Campos Vasquez here, working to protect the movie industry here, then Jack Valenti, who has been one of the key and the most important President Johnson advisor. And then if you take Dan Glickman, that used to be Minister of Agriculture and became head of the MPAA, you see how, for the US, the movie industry is extremely important. The people that are in charge of the movie industry are not, you know, saltimbanque. They are at the core of the American society, advisor of president, people in charge of security issues and the FBI kind of things, or former Minister of Agriculture that was dealing with quotas for corn or other agricultural products, and now working on quotas and this kind of thing for the movie industry and music one. I think it's extremely interesting to see how it works and how actually for what we call the soft power, which means, you know, the soft power expression, influence through movie, culture, the internet, values, basically my subject, you need people that have been working also on the hard power before, which means more security, military, these kind of things. Now, if you look at what's going on after this example, you realize how, if we are back on Mexico right now, you see how, it's not the only reason, how you explain that in Mexico, for example, 90% of the box office for the movie industry is for US American movies. They work well. And they work well actually everywhere in Latin America. When we speak about culture, at the same time, the movie industry is kind of an exception. And I have made, in my research, a lot of interviews, a lot of, I used tons of statistics as well to look how globalization affects culture and content in the music industry, movie industry, books industry, video games, and so on. And it's true that everywhere in the world, you have a kind of a global mainstream. There is some exception, but basically Beyoncé, Lady Gaga, Kanye West, Justin Timberlake, and we can take many other Avatar movie, Spider-Man and whatever, are kind of successful everywhere in the world. More or less in India, for example, or the box office for the movie industry is 80% for Indian movies, the so-called Bollywood. In France, it's about 50%, 50 US, 50 French, and a few 3 or 4% for all the other one. In Japan, it's about 50-50 as well. Japan 50 and the US 50. In China, it's about 50-50. Czech Republic 50-50. But in many other countries, it's more 10% for the local and 80% for the US. And in Latin America, you're very successful because it's more 90, 95 to 5. There is a kind of reborn right now in Argentina. I will go back on that a bit later. If you take the video games industry, it's even worse. Worst. If you think it's good to have more diversity by state, if you think US content are great, and actually I love the American culture. I've done my PhD, I lived there for several years. But at least the video game industry is not very diverse. Sometimes the studios in the video game industry are not American. For a few years ago, even like 2 years ago, the French were the first producer in the video game industry. You might not know that, but Activision, Blizzard, Ubisoft were all French companies. Part of Vivendi for Activision and Blizzard, and independent for Ubisoft. We sold a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Activision Blizzard, which are now back US company, but it has been for a long time a French one. But even though when we had Activision and Blizzard, the video games weren't at all French. So we own the company through Vivendi, which is a French conglomerate, but it doesn't produce any French video games. And Ubisoft today, which is a very good French and well-known brand, it is French. But if you see Ubisoft video games, with a few exceptions, they are mainly blockbuster American video games. And if you take Sony or Nintendo, you will see also that the games that especially are produced by Nintendo can be a little bit kind of Japanese sometimes, but more often they are very uniformized, mainstream kind of English kind of video games. So for the movie industry and the video game industry, the mainstream exists. And it's a very US-oriented mainstream. But I would say there are the only two exceptions. If you take all the other sector, information, television, television series, if you take music, if you take books, it is much more diverse than that. And actually, the mainstream is just one small part of the culture that you consume. It's probably the only one that is really global, for sure. But in Mexico, the books that you read are quite often Mexican. the music you hear is extremely Mexican as well. So I don't think you can summarize the mainstream as saying it is everywhere the same. Actually, it's everywhere very different. I don't know Mexican music very well, but I've listened a lot of Café Tacuba, for example, Tigres de Norte. I know Los Angeles Azules. I know RBD. I know reggaeton. Actually, I discovered reggaeton, of course, in Latin America, but especially here. And not only Calle 13, but other things better. For the older one, there is also Molotov, but it looks like a cocktail Molotov. But it was at that time, I think, they were against the power here, Caifanes or other things. So we don't know that very well in France. I know a little bit that because I have a radio show every Sunday night that is called Soft Power on French National Public Radio. And actually, this is why I leave tonight to be ready for my show on Sunday. You can listen to that if you speak French. Otherwise, you will listen some Mexican music sometimes because I try to put music from many countries. But to tell you the truth, don't cry, don't leave the room immediately. We are not listening Mexican music in France at all. And I don't think you listen a lot of South Korean music here. You know probably some K-pop artists. I mean, one, which is Psy, with the stupido kind of things, Gangnam Style, that everybody has seen. But okay, 3 times of your life, you don't listen this kind of music a lot. If you're in South Korea, you will listen K-pop all the time. And you won't mix that with J-pop, which is the pop in Japan, or with Cantonese pop, what we call Canto pop, more in Hong Kong, or with Mandarin pop that is very popular in mainland China. And if you say to a South Korea person, what about J-pop? He won't like that. He likes K-pop, and K-pop is not J-pop, and so on and so forth. So music is extremely diverse everywhere. And I could tell you, I could give you a lot of French names about music that you don't even know. By the way, Charles Aznavour and Jacques Brel are not the current hit in France. For those who are still listening, the things that even my grandmother thinks they were already square. If we go on the book industry, I mean, for that, at least we know Octavio Paz, we know Carlos Fuentes, we know some other writers, but literature and non-fiction are extremely national. You have the big blockbuster bestsellers, Dan Brown everywhere in the world, or 50 Shades of Grey, or these kind of things, but they are American, of course, or English sometimes, but a lot of books you read here are in Spanish, of course, and they are also by Mexican writers. So actually, the idea of having the globalization as a uniformization doesn't work very well. But it doesn't mean, for example, for Latin America, that you have a Latin America culture. As a French, I think the European has invented this idea of Latin America. We are the only one to believe it exists. And when I came in Latin America for the first time, I tried to find Latino culture, and I didn't. Because as you know more than I do, it's an extremely diverse continent. I mean, first of all, there is Brazil, and it's like if it would be another continent. You don't mix with Brazil, basically. And even Argentina, as you know, is not close to you for many reasons. And there is some exception. Probably you might know Los Fabulos Cadillac. I love Carnet de Voyage, I think in English, Motorcycle Diary, the movie, which was actually a very interesting movie because it was a mix of a Brazilian, if I remember well, director, Walter Salles, with, of course, a Mexican actor, Gael Garcia Bernal. I think it was Argentine actor, Rodrigo de la Serna, for the other character. The writer was Puerto Rican, Jose Rivera, and the music, I think, was from Uruguay. So it was kind of a Latino movie. But how many Latino movies do you have? How many band or even reggaeton music, even books that are extremely Latino and that are shared everywhere in Latin America. If I would be mean, I would say Mexican culture, Mexican people or Latino people, if such a thing exists, have two cultures, their own and the US culture. In a way, it's the same in Europe. We, as the French, I mean, don't repeat that, but we don't care about what the Romanian and the Polish are doing in movie industry and books. Nobody read anything like that. And actually, the German don't really like what the French do, and the Spanish are not reading a lot of Italian. There is some exception. You will give me probably some movie of Almodovar and then the books of some writers, and we got 2 Nobel Prize recently, even though the Minister of Culture wasn't even able in France to give away one name of the books he wrote. It was a big scandal in France because she had a lunch with him, but then the TV said, oh, you love him, you had a lunch with him, he got the Nobel Prize. How do you think, what did you read? And she wasn't even able to give a name of one book he wrote. So, but more bad than that, it's the fact that we don't share anything quite often with the European. And today, when you are a young kid in high school or in university, you know French culture when you're in France, you know German culture when you're in Germany, you know Spanish culture when you're in Spain, and American culture. US culture, but you don't know a lot of other European things, which is kind of bad. So, for me, the question now is to look a little bit how and why the US are so powerful. How? As I said before, they are not the only one. In many countries, national culture is still very powerful. So, globalization is not a uniformization, but they still are very powerful. So I will give you a few elements to explain, and probably you already know a lot of them, and you have a lot of, you can guess yourself. But I've made extensive research on that to see why the US are able to have a great soft power influence, why they are so powerful in the movie industry, the video game industry, and also sometimes in music, in books as well. You can come and sit down. Don't. I'm not going to. Or maybe you don't want to mix up with me, but there is a lot of seats here. And if you all sit, I will sit also myself. No. So I think there is many explanations that we can use, probably much more than what I'm going to say right now. But I would say the main one are for me the kind of culture they produce, the change of the definition of culture, the cultural diversity, of course, creative industries are for me the key points. And I'm going to go very quickly on all of them. I believe one of the reasons why the US is so strong in culture is, first of all, because they are able to work on different scale and different kind of culture, in all kind of culture, actually. We believe in general, and all the Guevarist, Trotskyist, Marxist people, we have a lot of that in France, and sometimes they are funny. And I kind of like them sometimes. They believe, the problem of the US is imperialism. And they believe it's because they are imperialist, because they have very strong cultural industries, which is just a question of marketing, money, and mass culture. And because of that, they are able to be powerful everywhere in the world with Disney and, Avatar and Spider-Man and even Kanye West. Yes. Kanye West as well. And of course, there is no debate about that. They are very powerful with mass culture, Broadway, Hollywood, the music industry in Los Angeles, and also the video game industry. But I will argue that actually, in addition of that, they are also very powerful in the other kind of culture. When you go for example, in the dance festival in France, you will see that a lot of the artists will be dancers from the US, from Mercedes Cunningham to Martha Graham, from Bill T. Jones to Trisha Brown, and so on and so forth. When you look at theater, a lot of people will speak about Tony Kirshner and the Wooster Group, and so on and so forth. And also high culture, and also counterculture. And by the way, if you want to understand the Silicon Valley, and it's I hope, I guess, a key chapter in my next book, Smart, I look at the Silicon Valley and the history of the Silicon Valley. And if you believe, and maybe some people in Mexico or in France believe that, this is just a question that the government will say, okay, we, or the mayor, we are going to build a smart city that is that will become Silicon Valley in this place. It's going to be wrong. Nobody, no government, no president, no mayor has said, I'm going to build a Silicon Valley there. If you want to understand the Silicon Valley, which is a singularity, idiosyncrasy, extremely original, you have to go back on the highway system of Eisenhower in the 50s. You have to go back on how the airport of San Francisco became a hub. You have to go back on the hippies in the 60s and Jack Kerouac on the road. You know, they went to San Francisco, the Beat generation. So it's linked actually to Kerouac, Cassidy, Ginsberg, on the road, the Beat generation, and even the Castro, the gay area in San Francisco, the veggie lesbians, the venture capitalists, of course, the exurb, which is exurbia, which is how a city goes. I mean, you have a second suburb and then a third suburb that we call exurb, which is highway and shopping malls. I mean, you know that because sometimes Mexico becomes a little bit like that too. All that explains Silicon Valley and probably many other things. I've wrote a chapter on that, so there is many other elements. So it's not something, even though, you know, I don't know, Marcel Ebrard, for example, say, okay, I'm going to build in Mexico a smart city because I believe the city needs a smart city. It won't work. It's not something you can decide. It's a long process. It has been the case for decades. So basically, mass culture, high culture, counterculture, internet culture, community culture as well. You can be, if you go to Europe, you will be extremely, I would say, impressed or maybe shocked. For example, you go in a ghetto in France where lives mainly Arab people. It's kind of poor area. They are very anti-American because of Israel policy, but they are extremely connected to US culture. Connected with the gangsta rap, they are connected with movies, blockbuster, but also whenever there is blacks or this kind of actors and so on and so forth. So it's mainstream, but it's also very community oriented. They know artists that the mainstream doesn't know, that goes directly with them. So I do believe that it is at the end the reason why the US, for one part, is very successful in soft power and culture. It's because they play on every kind of scale, every kind of culture at the same time. And when you want to criticize the US, in French we are very good on that, and I think we share that a bit with Mexico, and this kind of love-hate relationships. In France we hate the US, but we are the first country in the world with McDonald's number by inhabitants. And Google is 90 or 85% of the search engine in France, where even in the US is not that high. So it's always interesting to see when you don't like a country, you can also like it in another way. But at the end, when you want to criticize the US system, we read the Monde Diplomatique in France, which are quite often translation of articles from The Nation, the US magazine. We watch the movie of Michael Moore and read the book of Noam Chomsky. So basically, it's Americans that are criticizing the US. So at the end, I think this is really that imperialism and the mass and the counterculture, the community culture and the internet culture, the high culture and the low culture all together. Avatar and, I would say, the photograph Nan Goldin, Spider-Man and Tony Kushner, the gay Jewish playwright, Batman and Ang Lee at the same time. The second element of one of the reasons why the US are so powerful in culture, it's of course cultural industries. And scholars for a long time, politicians have seen the cultural industry structure as a key factor, of course, of the powerful culture that the US produce. And we quite often believe that is because of the market. You might know the Frankfurt School in the 40s, in the 50s, writers like Benjamin, Horkheimer, Adorno, of course. Even Hannah Arendt, which wasn't part of the Frankfurt School, but she was also thinking that cultural industry were kind of bad, and the guy that owns the corporation will decide what kind of content will be produced, and it will be cultural product that will be made by conglomerate, kind of factory. Everybody works for the factory. At the end, you have the product, and then basically it becomes a way to influence people with this kind of culture. The problem is that today, the conglomerate don't exist, at least as they were existing. They don't do product. Nobody works for them full time, and the independent works with them. So actually, it's a totally different picture than what used to be. And I don't have the time here, but I can take, I can explain that for the movie industry, for the music industry, for the book industry, for the video game industry, they kind of all work in a totally different way than what the cultural industry critics thought they are. Of course, they were in the 40s and the 50s. So I'm a big fan of Benjamin. So it's not. I don't want to criticize this kind of writer. But of course, the world is very different today than what it used to be. And for this very reason, their theory doesn't necessarily work very well. I don't even speak about the Adorno articles about jazz. Maybe the story would be a long debate. But basically, for Adorno, jazz cannot be really a culture. Because, for him, he wasn't racist. But for him, culture means, white, elite, European things. And having something from the black couldn't be culture. So he was kind of smart, and he said at the end, cannot be culture, so it is radio. So the famous articles about how the jazz is radio are interesting, but of course nobody today will say jazz is radio. Everybody will say jazz is music, so it's culture, and it's even probably the more classical music of the 20th century. But to come back on the cultural industries, very quickly, how it works today, I would say you have the big major in the movie industry, music industry, in the book industry, studios also in the video game industry. They are kind of banks. So they have the money, they are banks, and basically they fund projects. And they have what we call the green light, which is very important. They will say yes or no to one movie or to one book or whatever. It costs a lot of money. Today, a blockbuster in the movie industry can be $400, $500 million just for one feature film. But then it is done in general by a producing house, which is either within the big studio, what we call a specialized unit, or a little bit outside. They fund the producing house. So it's a kind of independent funded by them. And then this producing house hire other company, sometimes 20, 30, sometimes 100, independent, which can be startup, which can be small businesses, which can be other studio that will work on a specific project. Nobody is an employee. Everybody has a contract for one movie. Some actors can have for 2 or 3, but in general, it's a project-based model, totally the opposite of the traditional golden age of the Hollywood movie, where everybody was working full-time to do not one, but plenty of movies altogether. So the studios are still very influential, but they work with independent And it's the same in the video game industry. You will see big blockbuster quite often. You don't know that, but there is a lot of small, because they are not able, for example, if they do a movie for a video game, sorry, for the PS3, then they want to do that for another video game platform, for the Nintendo, for example, and they don't have the money, so or the tools. So they ask another studio to do it and to sell it and so on. But also for special effects, for some character, for the music, for many other things, they will hire several companies that will make, actually at the end, a real main video game. In the music, the same with the labels. In the book industry, with the imprints. So you are in a small imprint, you know the guy you work with, your publisher and so on, and it's part of a very large group that in general do all it does all the back office, international rights, the printing, these kind of things, but all the creative process, the marketing and the publicity and the PR relations are still in the small imprint. So you have the big and the small all together. And this is why quite often we mix up a little bit. We don't see that as a key element. To finish on that, I don't want to be too long. Of course, it used to be products, cultural goods, and now it's much more content that you will use on several platforms, several medias. There are also streams. They can be services. They can be formats, apps. So many things, but not just one cultural good. There is two other elements. I'm going to go very quick on that because I don't have the time to go on that very quickly. But another reason is probably that and it's linked with what I've said just before with Adorno. We used to think, especially the French, we are very good on that, and sometimes in Latin America and Argentina you have that too because they look at Europe a lot, this kind of hierarchy for culture. So basically, we believe there is such thing as the art, and it is high culture, and then there is all the other things, basically, and at the end you have, I don't know, reggaeton, and it is low culture, and of course it's not good. This is the way, quite often actually, we believe art is in France and in Europe. You have that also in Germany a lot, in Spain, in Italy. Vargas Llosa kind of things. I had a fight with him in his book. He commented my own book, and he was very friendly, but basically he said he did a very good job. I love what he said, but the culture he described, I don't like that. I don't want that. It's funny because, when it's raining, what do you say? I don't like rain. Yes, but it's still raining. So the thing is more to understand why the people are liking a culture that is not what you like. And the reality is that the hierarchy, as we believe in it, with the high-low culture, doesn't exist anymore. And it even less exists because of the globalization and because of the internet. So video games, of course, it can be hard. Series TVs, mangas, startup, publicity, design, all that is also part of the arts. And a few years ago, the more probably arty kind of high culture French journal, les cahiers du cinéma, like the traditional Godard, Truffaut journal for movie industry, said, series TVs, American series TVs, US series TVs are the most creative right now. So even them, they accept the idea of, it's not that simple to say there is such a good things that is art and a bad one that is popular culture. Of course, another also key element to explain how the US is so powerful is what I call, a lot of people call cultural diversity. And I try to, very quickly, to give you a kind of an element that and you might think about that later on. We believe in Europe, it's also the case, I think, in Latin America quite often. I mean, Brazil has I work a lot on that. India also, the Québécois, of course, the Canadian that speak French. We believe in cultural diversity, and we have made a lot of fight at UNESCO and other international institutions about that. And I believe we were right. I've been in South Korea, and when you see how the US are destroying quotas for the movie industry just to have more US movies, blockbuster in South Korea and less South Korea movie, you realize how they really destroy cultural diversity. And when they did this negotiation, they obtained, they were able to get rid of a part of the quota system. And a few years after that, the blockbusters from the US were much more important in the total box office than before. And the Korean, what we call Alwi, how do you say that? Alwi, which is the new wave of South Korea movies and music, Hallue, I think. It's like the K-pop as well is part of the Hallue, possible maybe. You see how it has a real reaction, a real effect on the box office. And actually, what I said about Mexico in the beginning with the movie industry, or how the US are working in Brazil or Argentina to destroy any way to fund the local music industry to promote more their own music is extremely a key thing to destroy cultural diversity. But then, if we look at inside, we have a very different pictures. In France, for example, we believe in cultural diversity when it's abroad. But at home, what about the culture for the Arabs? We don't care. What about the local culture, the folk culture, the indigenous culture? We don't care. The Québécois that are so proud about cultural diversity all the time, they didn't care about Aborigine culture. And don't even speak about the Chinese, that believe in cultural diversity when it's to have more Chinese product abroad. But when it's at home, speak about the Tibetan story, for example, or Taiwanese, or even right now Hong Kongese, and you will see what is the reality of cultural diversity at home. Whether in the US, it's exactly the opposite. I told you how they destroy cultural diversity abroad, but at home, they do it a lot. First of all, because, as you know, there is 51% of their population that is Hispanic. And among them, 51 million Hispanic people in the US, which means 15% of the population. And I think there is 30 million Mexicans, 38 million of blacks, 15 million of Asian, among them probably close to 3 million Chinese. So it is a very diverse culture by definition. And when you speak about cultural diversity in France on the movie industry, we love diversity. But then, how many Chinese movies we have seen? A few. How many Mexican movies we have seen? Probably none, or very few. Whether, of course, in the US, by definition, you have movies from Mexicans just because you have Mexicans. And I think you got the point. But basically, you can think about that a bit more. But the fact that you really believe in cultural diversity abroad, but you don't do it at home. Or on the contrary, the US destroy cultural diversity abroad, but do it at home. It's, for me, extremely interesting. And I think it's part of the reason why they are also very powerful, because they are able to produce a culture that already, from the beginning, is organized. They think about the product as a product for the world, with characters that are blacks and more Latino right now, that are already extremely diverse, because they produce a culture that is more diverse, even though they destroy the diversity of culture abroad. To go a little bit more on that, I will go back now, after the US, on emerging country, before finishing with the internet. We have 10 more minutes, is okay? So I told you a little bit before when I began, about emerging country, it's not just the BRICS, it's also more 20 plus country. They emerge with their culture, with their values, with their internet. And we can take many examples of that. I mean, Al Jazeera, for example, but also NBC, Rotana, groups like Reliance in India, which bought a part of DreamWorks. And I don't know if you have heard the news this morning, but Alibaba is closed. It's a rumor, but it wasn't, I mean, they didn't, you know, say that it was fake or not real. So we believe it might be the case. They are buying Lionsgate, which is one of the key studios in the movie industry in the US. But Reliance bought a part of DreamWorks, and Sahara, another big Indian giant, bought, I mean, tried to buy the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. At the end, they weren't able to do that, but, you know, the lion, the famous Leo lion, the name is Leo, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century movie, could have been Indian, you know, would have been Indian Leo and not a US lion. Of course, TV Globo, as you know, it's a big player in the game. And then I don't even mention Televisa because you won't like me if I do that. But, you know, like it or not, Televisa is a key player in the game of television worldwide, and also with the debate that you know probably pretty well with Univision. They don't own Univision, but when you look at Univision, you believe they own it. And of course, there is Telemundo that basically now fought to have also some telenovelas from Televisa. So at the end, they are all the same, whatever. And we can take many other examples with the K-pop, J-pop, CCTV in China. I don't have enough time to be more in the detail of that, but you got the point, I guess. Just one quick, I would say, image that I got on emerging country. I met a lot of startups here in Mexico. I've been, I told you, in Monterrey, but also in Veracruz. I've been in Puebla, Guadalajara, Xelapa, you say Jalapa, right? So several cities in this country, but also in I met startups, people that are doing cultural industry, sometimes owner of big multiplexes, studios, and so on, in, let's say, in Rio de Janeiro, in Dubai, in Shanghai, in Beirut, in places like that. I met hundreds of them. And I was kind of shocked. For me, as a European, it's really a shock how quite often you are in front of somebody who's 45 years old. I mean, it looks maybe old for you, but it's pretty young, you know, when you are the head of a big conglomerate or a multiplex. In general, in India, in Mumbai, in Rio de Janeiro, or in Dubai, is very friendly. He opens his arm and his eyes and he thinks about, he's creating, building the culture of the future thanks to the internet. And you really got this impression at NBC in Riyadh, at Rotana in Lebanon, or in many other places in emerging countries. And then I'm back in France, you know, and it's the same in Spain, the same in Italy, the same in Germany, sometimes the same in UK. And you are with the same guy, I mean, the owner of the studio or the owner of the multiplex guy or some music A&R people or startups. And more, quite often, they are 65 years old plus. They are not very friendly, but that's not the point. Sometimes they are friendly. But in general, they are like, it's very dangerous because we have to protect the culture of the past. And the kind of opposition between this very opportunities way of thinking of the culture of the future that I've seen in Mexico, and the idea of what's happening, globalization and digitalization, is a threat for culture. In one side, very optimistic. In the other side, more pessimistic. In one side, aggressive, wanted to do things, enthusiastic. In the other side, pessimist, fearful, defensive, kind of chilly, is for me an extremely interesting and for European sad comparison. at least I would say that you have the chance to be in the good side of the world, of history, and I really believe emerging countries can change their culture, can change the world, and the internet, because they don't have all the, the problems we had between, the past, the traditional way of thinking of culture, how to make the transition from analogic to digital, with the copyright and all this kind of stuff. I will finish this presentation with a quick note on the internet. Even though I spoke already about the internet several times, what I've seen everywhere in the world, it's not the global conversation that some people in the Silicon Valley believe in. If you speak at Google, at Facebook, at Twitter, I've been in all these big corporations in the few last years, quite often, and they wrote that in interviews, in books, they have said that, we are entering a global conversation, as I told you in the beginning of this discussion. The frontiers are not as important as before, that the content will be more global and more uniformized, and that at the end, they really believe on something that is for sure US culture, but they believe in something that will be shared, and in a good way, in a positive way, by everybody. What I've seen, what I've found on the ground, in the field, in the last couple of years, the last 5 years actually, it's none of that. And I told you that before, but for me, what internet is doing, it's not at all, the good word is not globalization. Internet is not more globalized than what we believe. It is actually much more fragmented. So fragmentation is much more what internet will become than globalization. There is a word in English that is interesting that I don't know in Spanish, but I think you're like us. We have only one word for two ideas. It is the word frontière. En français, in French, frontière. And I think in Spanish it's kind of the same. In English, you have two words for frontière. You have border and you have frontière. The border, you know what is it? It's between Mexico and the US, which is, you need a visa, you need a passport, there is the flag, there is the police, and so on and so forth. And so I would say there is no border on the internet, except with China, with Iran, and also with Cuba, for example, because in Cuba you have a very bad access of the internet, even though the propaganda said, we open 100 plus cyber cafe, and I was in Cuba a few weeks ago, and I went to the cafe and they don't exist. They just don't exist. So basically, if you want internet, either you have a military guy in your building and he shares with you and you have to pay, or you go in a big hotels, international hotels, and it costs 10 euro an hour, which is of course not possible for any Cuban normal people. So there is no border on the internet for sure, but there is frontier. Frontier means a symbolic things, which means it's linked to language, it's linked to the cultural sphere you live in, it's linked with your territory. And this is why at the end you can negotiate with the US NAFTA, and you have done that. So then there is no border, but there is still some frontier. And I think it's extremely important. And actually, we are already 2.7 billion people on the internet worldwide. In 5 years, we will be 5 billion. In 10 years, probably close to 7 billion. All the people that today have what we call a feature phone, a basic phone, will have a smartphone in the next years to come. Why? Because smartphones are already in Africa, available at $30 or $40, and even tablets. So access will be possible. Doesn't mean that we don't have to work on digital literacy, which is an extremely important thing. I think the digital divide won't be the debate. The next debate is digital literacy. And actually, libraries have a role to play on that. I believe libraries are a place where you should do digital literacy, which means, okay, you have access to the web, but what about your data? What about your privacy? Wikipedia is wonderful. I love Wikipedia. When you're in Africa, you see how Wikipedia changed the life of the people. They have access to an encyclopedia that nobody was able to pay for a few years ago. And they even have dictionary that weren't existing for a lot of languages in India, in Kenya, in Cameroon. I've seen that, how the people access to dictionary for their own language where they weren't able to buy any dictionary before. Sometimes the dictionary weren't even existing. But sometimes, you know, there is mistake on Wikipedia or things that are not really good. This is why digital literacy is important. So I believe basically internet is going to be more and more not really local. I never said it was global, or we thought it was global and now it's local. It's not as simple. It is much complicated. It can be sometimes global for a community. For example, the Mexicans, millions of Mexicans are speaking to millions of other Mexicans that live across the border. So it's not just in Mexico, it's two countries. But of course, it's still a conversation in Spanish between Mexicans. You have the same with Iran and Tehran JLS, which is the Iranian area in Los Angeles. Of course, Cuba and Miami and these kind of things, even though it doesn't work on the internet, but it works with the so-called pendrives, you say, I think in Spanish, which is like a kind of USB key that everybody has in Cuba, and with that they get all the music they want and share. So they share their pendrives all the time. It's very interesting and funny. Every taxi has that, every house has that, and so on. So I believe territorialization is extremely important on the internet. And again, it is a good news for Mexico, because internet is not such a thing that comes from the US, that you basically receive as a kind of, I would say, domination and imperialism, and you won't have any way to protect from that. Infrastructure and software hardware are sometimes global, but contents are not. Content don't travel well on the internet. And this is why, to conclude, I would say that I'm not an anti-American, anti-US. Again, I did my PhD there. I lived in the US, and actually I love this country. Sometimes it's even more fun than to be in France for many reasons. But I think you have the right as Mexican to protect your culture. I don't believe in quotas. I, of course, don't believe in censorship. But I believe on doing things that will make basically your content available, first of all, for the Mexican. And first of all, I believe internet will be more and more like that. Website, the content you will use, the music you will listen are very linked to where you live, the place where you need information, the shops you go to buy, and things, and so on and so forth. So to conclude in one sentence, I will say that actually internet won't be, and globalization won't be good or bad by themselves. It's not a question of to be pessimistic or to be optimistic. It's a question to be realistic. And so it will depend basically of what you, me, and actually all together, nosotros, will do with it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Frédéric. ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Comentario?
We have 10 minutes, a little bit more?
More or less.
15, 20?
También.
Then I stay in Mexico because I miss my plane. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's up to you. You have to find me a party where I'm going tonight if I stay here. But then I won't do my radio show Sunday, so it might be not as good.
¿Comentario? Anímense. Eso.
Maybe two to begin with.
Por favor, digan su nombre y la carrera que estudian. Si pueden hablar en inglés, mejor.
Hi, Frédéric.
Hi.
My name is Edgar. I study communications and digital media. And actually, my question goes. It's about what you talked about in the U.S. and the way they manage culture. Some classmates and me were making this investigation on actually gay perception of the way the gay culture has been used by the American media. Well, they are the main cultural producers, and we were discussing this like two-sided treatment the gay culture has had. On one side, there's this acceptance and this, like, I don't know, approach they having, like being gay is okay and it's bad to I don't know, like promote homophobic behaviors and things like that. But at the same time, on a more individual level, or I wouldn't like to call it like that, it's like more in a community level, there's still this, I don't know how to say it, like the people still don't accept 100% this kind of way of living, you know. And well, my question goes in, how do you dealt with that? Because I was reading your the introduction to Global Gate, your book, and these books at Cafe thing
in Jordan.
Yeah.
Amman.
And I investigated a little bit more, and actually it has been closed.
I know.
And here in Mexico, it's like kind of the same way. Here in the city, we are very, like, we accept the gay culture and things like that, but at the same time, there's like this double entendre that it's not okay to be gay or something like that. So, well, can you comment on that?
Hi. My group arrived a little late. We were in the class, but
Yes, I saw. I know.
Yeah.
I noticed that. Yes.
First of all, my name is Jose Pablo. I'm studying international relations. I want to congratulate you because I think it was a very clear perspective about culture. And during our class, along all the semester, we talked a lot about the fact of culture, about if it's the process it's being applied to culture because of globalization. And we got to agree on some points. For example, the fact of, as you were saying, like the homogenization from the US, and in the other hand, the dissemination for other cultures. But one of the interesting facts we got to see was that even though different cultures get to interact between each other, there is some point where there is some kind of resistance from one to another to evict a complete homogenization. And I think that's a very interesting point to say, why even though our influence on the media and on economics and on all of that stuff has been very related to the US, still we are very profound with our values, with our traditions. And I think that's very interesting what you were saying about also about the fact of internet, right? Like how it has been very territorial and fragmented. And I just wanted to congratulate you, and I think that's very interesting, how to know, even though we were seeing that there's a theory that says that in order to be like an interaction or mostly an interaction between cultures, there have to be like out of 5 points, 4 have to be like common, like for example, Mexico and Argentina have like the right or the chance to interact because of the language, because of the past, because of their food, and because of maybe another thing. But there will be always something there that will be like your identity or your origins that will remain and that will not be letting a total homogenization. That's what I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Third, is he here? We can take 3 or 4. You also? You don't arrive. You didn't arrive late, right? Okay. No. Just to be.
Hi,
Go ahead.
Frédéric.
Sorry. Hi.
My name is Andrea.
Hi, Andrea.
I study
I like the
journalism.
Spanish. Like, hi, Frédéric.
I study journalism.
In
And
Spanish, it's more common than in French. In French, you say
Hi.
Mr. Professor. Sorry.
oh, Monsieur.
But I don't do that, sorry.
Well, at this class, my creative writing class, our professor was telling us that when a system criticizes the same system, it is not considered a real or an authentic criticism towards the system, because he was telling us that it is kind of making ourselves look stupid, believing that the system is so strong that it is able to criticize itself and still be still that strong. So I don't know, I want to know what you think about that.
So basically, it's on the fact that you are able to criticize the system, but still
still be inside the system and still
Yes.
being not able to question and the
Yes,
system. stuff like
extremely good question. You?
that. Thank you.
Yes. And then the last one, if there is.
Hi, my name is Rodolfo and I study communication and digital media. My question is really concrete. What do you think that is needed for a change in the cultural industry? Do we need a change in the creators or a change in the audience?
You mean Mexico?
In Mexico or in an international context?
To change the cultural industry? Last question.
I think it's better
Okay.
to leave it there.
So I answered quickly the different question. I begin with your question. Basically, you said congratulations. So I like the question. Thank you. No, to go on what you said, which is very interesting about resistance. You know, a lot of people are thinking culture as a necessity to resist, and they think imperialism is a matter of money, and you know, you have the big, basically what, I mean, this kind of Castro way of thinking the world. They are against you and you are resisting imperialistic things. It doesn't work like that. And it never worked, but less in a time of globalization and in a time on, I would say, on digitalization. And this is why actually, you know, in the 70s, I wrote some history about that, so I know a bit the debate. The debate for the gay community, for example, was, okay, we want to be free, okay? We are in a bad shape because they are homophobic. So our models are USSR, China, Mao China, and Castro, basically. What's the idea? I mean, the gay movement, the lesbian movement in the US, in France, in Italy, in Germany, they were thinking that the revolution, the gay revolution, will come from these directions. And then suddenly, a little bit after that, we realized that, you know, in USSR, they were putting the gays in the cold Siberia to have them doing workforce and dying in the snow. In Mao China, they were basically doing them, asking them to become farmers and die because they didn't eat anything. And in Cuba, basically, they put them electricity to have them becoming heterosexual. Of course, it didn't work, but still, the revolution didn't come from these places. It came more from the Castro area than from the Castros in Cuba, to summarize. So when I say that, it's this idea of resistance is not, I think, the good approach on the question. You didn't say that, but I kind of always, you know, think that we are afraid by balkanization of the internet and culture. We are afraid by kind of Libanization because all the territory will keep their culture or we will have to protect it. I don't believe it works like that. First of all, if you want to succeed in content industry, in soft power, you need great content. And to have great content, you need freedom of artists, you need diversity, you need the money of the big company, but also the independent. Without independent, you won't do anything, because the mainstream cannot generate it by itself. The mainstream is good because it's the only way to speak to millions of people in one time. But when you want to do a new movie, you cannot do the same. You know, we are not speaking about Coca-Cola. We are speaking about content. And in cultural industry, the important word is not industry, it is culture. And every movie, even the worst, every music, even something you don't like, trash, reggaeton things, is a prototype. And then you need to have a new prototype when you want to create something else. And this is why, actually, the good news is the independent are extremely important. This is why diversity, the border, the things that are a little bit at the margin. This is why, I mean, who does innovation? Who take risk? Who really do innovation, research and development? It's always done by the university in the US. If you forget that, you don't understand Hollywood. Hollywood is done thanks to UCLA and to USC and to the Tisch School in NYU and these kind of things. And then you need the innovation by the startup, by the little guy, by the independent. And this is how today we believe Disney bought Pixar. But actually it's kind of Pixar that bought Disney, because when you look at the animated studio within Disney, it is Pixar. So basically the independent, Pixar wasn't a very small independent, for true, it was already big. But if you take the history of Hollywood, it has been always the independent that becomes the studio. From the beginning, and when they left Edison in New York, the Jewish left to LA because they were independent and they didn't like the trust of Edison. And then they create their big studios, so they became, in fact, the studio themselves. But then other independents arrive, and this is why actually DreamWorks or Miramax or Pixar were a key player in the game. So at the end, I really believe in this dialogue between the two, and this is why the question about being in the system, yes, it's a little bit the same answer, because being in the system, everybody is in the system. You know, in France, I read an article a few years ago, like 4 pages, in one of the most famous anti-American newspaper, Télérama, very famous one, very good one, on culture. And they were speaking about the movie of Jim Jarmusch, Broken Flowers. Actually, I love Jim Jarmusch, and it's a very good movie. So it was 4 pages of interview with him, and the journalist was like, oh yes, you fight against the bad Hollywood system, and you are the independent, and how you are able to survive in this hostile world, and so on. It was like 4 pages of that. And Jim Jarmusch was great, and so on. At the end, you have just one line. Broken Flowers will be out, I don't know, next week, was probably in October or something, was a film of 120 minutes, a focus feature movie. Focus feature is 100% a major. It owns 100% by Universal. So the independent is always linked with the studio in a way or another. Everybody, it doesn't exist one artist that doesn't want to sell. They don't want to sell out, but they want to sell because they want people. So what they want, at the same time, they want to keep their art. They want to stay, you know, what they really believe in. So I understand that, it's great. But this idea to make like the opposition of the independent, the big one, and so on, doesn't work. And this is why it works in the US. It's always all together mixed. And this is why basically the Chinese, they pour millions of dollars in their movie industry, but they haven't been able to produce one blockbuster worldwide, except Kung Fu Panda, that has been made by DreamWorks, the US company. Why? Because they don't believe in the independent. They don't believe in the small guy, the diversity, the gay, the woman, the guy will be from like Taiwan, like Ang Lee. Ang Lee was invited by China. They really wanted to do a movie with him, and then something was wrong. A wife of a vice president, something didn't like pictures, whatever in the movie. They basically canceled the movie, was censored, and Ang went back to the US. And this is why it's not going to work if you don't allow the artists, the freedom of artists, and so everybody is within the system, but at the same time, the system has to allow a lot of diversity, a lot of independence, a lot actually of creativity. On the question on Mexico, do we need a change on cultural industries? I mean, cultural industries by definition are changing all the time. They are very Schumpeterian. If you understand the Schumpeter name, you know, it's a famous economist. Schumpeter wrote about creative destruction. So you create, but then you destroy, and then we recreate. And in the cultural industry, especially in the digital industries, it's very Schumpeterian all the time. So you have destruction of creativity every time, but also recreation. And this is why you have a startup that it failed, you create, you know, the famous formula in Silicon Valley, fail quick, which means you can fail, but don't keep your company too long if it doesn't work. You fail, it's dead, you create a new one, and you go ahead and you move on. It's a way of thinking. So creative industries are changing all the time. So if you believe they are going to become, let's say, more regulated and the government has to do it, it has a name, it's Venezuela. And now all the telenovelas from Venezuela are made in Miami. And there is nothing in culture in Venezuela. Don't even speak about Cuba, where no books, no films, and less music, which is a shame. You know, to listen good Cuban music, you go to Miami. So it's the end of something, the end of an empire, which was a small empire, but has been long for a long time. I finished with the question about the gay. And I'm sorry, I didn't speak enough probably about this book, but you know, it was more media students. So if one day there is a gender studies group here, I will be happy to focus more on that. But to answer the question, I mean, first of all, I won't follow you at all on what you said on, you know, go 1 week in Jordan, come back to Mexico, and you tell me the difference. So this is not the same world at all. And this is why actually I began my book with this cafe, which I know can be closed, even because I wrote about it, and which is of course bad if it happens. I know the guy, we spoke quite often, so I know he opened another one, but it's a long story. But there is 8 countries in the world today where you can get death penalty because you're gay. And there is 70 others where you can go to jail just because you're gay. Mexico is not among them. You can even married in Mexico City. And this morning I was with Marcelo Ebrard, and 3 times in our interview he spoke about, you know, gay marriage in Mexico. I don't know if he spoke because of me, but it was like very, you know, of course no politicians in China or in the Middle East or in Africa will speak even one word about this issue. Then, of course, there is a question of, you know, you can have great laws, and then the life of the people is not necessarily a good one. And actually, all my book is about that, because laws doesn't mean reality. You have countries typically like, for example, South Africa, where in theory it's perfect. It's even the worst, the better country in the world. The constitution is gay-friendly, the only one for now, with a mention for the gay in the constitution, and sexual orientation is a constitutional right in South Africa, and they have gay marriage, and they have at that very early on. But as you know, the situation of gays, especially lesbians in townships, is extremely difficult with rapes. So right doesn't mean that the reality is good. On the contrary, you have countries like Singapore, for example, where the homosexuality is still forbidden in Singapore. But when you go to Singapore, you will see tons of cafes and bars and clubs because they don't care. In a way, it's a little bit like that in Cuba, where officially it's still a problem in many aspects. If you create a gay association in Cuba for human rights, you go to jail. and I was arrested in Cuba for a few hours. It wasn't very bad, but just because we were working with other people and so on. So it's not very. The law is not good, but actually the life is kind of okay. Not totally, but at least okay, very controlled by the police, but basically okay. So the legislation, the law, the reality are not the same. And there is a traditional critiques by the Marxists, and you might know the very famous discussion by Marx on human rights and civil rights and law, saying that we don't really need, I mean, the human rights are not, are kind of something that is not able to really protect the people. I mean, it's a long debate. I don't believe in that one second. I think we have to begin by the rights. You need the rights. Then, of course, the rights won't do anything. But without rights, you are not able to change the situation of the people. And to conclude, I will say that I'm very interested and even proud for you how in Latin America you have been ahead of this trend much more quicker than France, for example, or UK or Germany. You know, for a very long time, human rights was something that were, you know, the French were doing that, the British. So basically, we wrote part of the declaration, of course, the French Declaration of Human Rights in 1789, but also the 1948, and it was signed in Paris at the Trocadero. And you know, Europe is in general they explain to the world what they have to do about human rights. But on gay marriage, South Africa, actually Argentina, Mexico for one part, Brazil, Uruguay. I mean, this kind of minuscule Uruguay was before France, before Italy, where there is not even real civil unions in Italy, before Germany, before some other country in Europe. So I conclude with that because I think it says a lot also on globalization and how emerging countries are changing the world. It's not just a question of economy. It's not just a question of demography. Emerging countries are also, I say that again, but because it's an answer to your question, emerging with their culture, with their internet, and with their law and civil rights, which has been the case on the gay issue. Of course, then, there is a lot of things to do, and you're young, so you have a lot of years to change after the law, to change the prejudices. Thank you.